You were always the lesser sister, Elira. Did you truly believe a king would choose you? The words drifted through the silver dark beneath the moon tree, and something inside her chest snapped like a bowstring pulled past its limit. She felt it as a physical wound, a hot line of pain that ran from her sternum to her spine, the mate bond she had carried for 3 years tearing loose at its root. Her knees nearly buckled. Cold flooded her veins where warmth had lived that morning. And there, framed against the pale luminescence of the ancient tree whose blossoms only opened under a full moon, she saw them. Calen Stormhold, Alpha King of the Ashfall territories, the man she had promised her life to, was kissing her younger sister Marisol beneath the sacred boughs, one hand cradling the back of Marisol's head as though she were something precious and rare. Elira did not scream. She stood in the shadow of a moonlit hedge, one hand pressed flat against the ache in her chest, and she made a single, silent promise to herself. They would learn what they had thrown away, but not tonight, and not from her lips. She had come to the garden to tell him news that would have changed everything. In the pocket of her plain grey gown was a slip of parchment from the pack healer, a confirmation of something fragile and new beginning inside her, and she had walked out under the moon with her heart wide open, ready to give him the one gift no crown could match. Instead, she had found him giving himself to Marisol. She stood very still and listened, because listening was the only weapon she had ever been permitted, and Calen was speaking in the low, coaxing voice she had once believed belonged only to her. He was telling her sister that the alliance with the Silverbrook Pax required a bride of stronger blood, that Elira's line was thin, her wolf weak, her usefulness spent. He said the council had already drawn up the papers to set her aside. He said it the way a man discusses the weather, and Marisol laughed, soft and pleased, and pressed closer to him, and the parchment in Elira's pocket felt suddenly like a stone. For a long moment she could not move. The scent of moon blossom, sweet and cold, filled her throat until she thought she might be sick. She had given this man 3 years. She had translated the old treaties that no one else in the court could read, negotiated the grain shipments that kept the eastern villages alive through the bitter winters, memorized the bloodlines and the debts and the quiet grudges that held the fractious Ashfall Pax together. She had done it in the shadows, without title beyond consort, without thanks, because she had loved him and believed that love was a kind of citizenship. And in one moonlit breath she understood that she had been a tool, sharpened and used, and now, apparently, to be discarded for a prettier blade. The pain in her chest pulsed again, and she pressed her palm harder against it, and she did not let a single sound escape. She turned and walked back toward the palace, her steps measured, her spine straight, because if there was one thing 3 years at Calen's court had taught her, it was that composure was armor, and armor was survival. Behind her she heard Marisol ask what would become of the old consort, and she heard Calen answer that his sister would be given a modest allowance and a house in the border country, somewhere quiet, somewhere she could not embarrass the throne. A house in the border country. A cage disguised as a cottage. She almost laughed at the tidy cruelty of it, at how thoroughly they had planned her erasure while she was drafting the very treaties that would make their marriage possible. She reached the servants' corridor, cool stone under her feet, and she let herself breathe, one slow, measured breath, and then another, and with each one, the grief in her hardened into something colder and far more useful. That night she did not sleep. She sat at the small writing desk in the consort's chambers, the room that had never quite been hers, and she began, methodically, to take inventory of everything she truly possessed. Not the jewels Kaelin had given her, which she would leave on the pillow, not the gowns commissioned in her name, which belonged to the crown, not the title, which had always been a courtesy and never a right. What she possessed was knowledge, and knowledge, she had long ago learned, could be carried out of any palace hidden behind a calm face. She possessed the master ledger of the Ashfall treasury, every figure of which she had memorized, because Kaelin's steward could not do sums. She possessed the location of the collapsed silver mine in the northern reaches that the court believed exhausted, which she had discovered, through old survey maps, was merely flooded and could be drained. And she possessed a name, written in her own careful hand at the bottom of a letter she had never sent. Corvin Nightbane, alpha of the Iron Root Packs, Kaelin's oldest rival, the one man in the 4 territories whom her husband feared. She had met Corvin once, 2 winters past, at a border parley Kaelin had nearly bungled. While the 2 alphas snarled and postured, it had been Elira who found the compromise, a clause about shared hunting grounds that saved 100 lives. Corvin had watched her the whole time with dark, unhurried eyes, and at the end he had said only, quietly, so that Kaelin could not hear, that any king who let his cleverest adviser stand behind his chair instead of beside it was a fool who would one day lose his kingdom. She had thought it presumptuous then. She thought it prophetic now. She drew the unsent letter toward her, dipped her pen, and beneath the old lines she added 3 new ones. Then she began, with the patience of a woman who has already survived the worst thing that will happen to her, to plan her disappearance. By the grey hour before dawn, when the palace still slept, and even the guards had grown drowsy at their posts, Elira had made herself ready. She wore travelling clothes she had sewn herself over the past year, plain and warm and free of any crest, because some quiet instinct had been preparing her for this long before her mind admitted it. Into a single leather satchel she packed the survey maps of the flooded mine, a copy of the treasury ledger written out in a cipher only she could read, the healer's slip of parchment folded against her heart, and a small, heavy pouch of silver coins she had been setting aside, one at a time, from the household accounts she managed, never enough to be noticed, always enough to matter. 3 years of small foresight, of setting a single coin aside each week and telling no one, had become the foundation of her freedom. She left everything else. The emerald betrothal ring she placed in the center of the pillow where Kaelin would see it. The consort circlet she hung on the bedpost. The gowns she left in the wardrobe like the shed skins of a person she no longer intended to be. At the small door near the kitchens, she found Maren waiting, and her breath caught, because for one cold instant she thought she had been discovered. But Maren, the old pack healer who had confirmed her pregnancy and delivered half the children of the court, only held out a stoppered flask and a wrapped parcel of bread and dried meat, and said, in her low, rough voice, that she had seen the way the king looked at the younger sister and had known this night would come. Elira's composure nearly broke then. It is one thing to endure cruelty, and quite another to be met, unexpectedly, with kindness. Maren took her face in 2 calloused hands and told her that a weak wolf and a strong mind were not the same thing, that Kaelin had confused the one for the other, and that the confusion would cost him everything he loved. Then she pressed a folded scrap of paper into Elira's palm, a name and a village 3 days east, a widowed cousin who took in travellers and asked no questions, and she said, "Go, child, and do not look back at a house that was never a home." Elira went. She slipped through the kitchen door and across the frost-silvered garden, past the very hedge where she had stood the night before, and she did not glance toward the moon tree. She walked out through the postern gate that Maren's grandson, a young guard who owed the healer his life, had left unbarred, and she stepped onto the eastern road as the first thin light bled up over the mountains. Her chest still ached where the bond had torn, a phantom pain that would flare for months to come, a hollow place where a marriage had been. But with every step away from the palace, the pain grew a little more bearable, transmuted a little further into resolve. She thought of the words Kaelan had spoken beneath the tree, that she was the lesser sister, that a king would never choose her, and she let them settle into her bones, not as a wound, but as a foundation. She had never needed him to choose her. She would build a place where she did the choosing. The road east ran through country she had only ever crossed in a curtained carriage, and now she saw it plainly, the hard scrabble villages, the thin cattle, the taxes bleeding the border packs dry to fund a court that despised them. She saw the crumbling bridges Kaelan's council had voted 3 times to repair and never had, the granaries standing empty because the grain she had negotiated never reached the people it was meant for. She had known, abstractly, from behind her ledgers, that the Ashfall territories were rotting from the inside. Walking through them, she felt it in her feet. And she understood, with the cold clarity that had replaced her grief, that Kaelan's kingdom was a fine, gilded shell around a hollow core, that it was held together not by his crown, but by the very administration he had just cast out onto the road with a torn bond and a bag of hoarded coins. She wondered how long it would take him to notice. She wondered whether Marisol knew the difference between reading a treaty and standing prettily beneath a tree. She suspected she was about to find out. On the second night, sheltering in an abandoned shepherd's hut while rain hammered the turf roof, Elira let herself weep at last, quietly, thoroughly, for the man she had believed Kaelan to be, and for the child she carried into an uncertain world, and for the girl she had once been, who thought that loving someone completely was the same as being safe with them. She wept until the well ran dry, and then she slept, and in the morning the rain had stopped, and the sky was scrubbed clean and pale, and she rose and washed her face in a cold stream, and did not weep again. Grief, she had decided, was a debt she would pay in installments, in the dark, in private, and never on the schedule of the people who had caused it. In daylight, she would be a woman with a plan. She reached the widow's village on the 3rd day, footsore and hollow-eyed, and Maren's cousin took one look at her, at the fine-boned face gone grey with exhaustion and the fierce steadiness in her eyes, and stepped back to let her in without a single question, as promised. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Elira slept in a bed that no one could order her out of, and she dreamed not of the moon tree, but of a flooded mine, silver bright beneath black water, waiting to be drained. 6 months later, in the iron-root city of Hollowmere, where the forges never cooled, and the streets climbed the mountainside in tiers of black stone, there was a woman named Elira Ashcroft, whom everyone spoke of, and few had truly met. She had appeared at the beginning of spring, they said, a widow from the western border with nothing but a satchel of maps and a mind like a steel trap, and she had walked into the offices of the Iron Root Mining Guild and offered to drain and reopen a mine that 3 separate engineers had declared dead. She had been laughed at. She had produced her survey figures, her flow calculations, her staged plan for the pumps and the timbering and the ventilation, all written out in a hand so precise it looked engraved, and the laughter had stopped. The guild had given her the smallest and most hopeless of their holdings, a flooded shaft in the northern reaches that no one else would touch, on the condition that she front half the cost herself and take the loss alone if she failed. She had emptied her pouch of hoarded silver onto the table and said only that she would take those terms. She had not failed. By midsummer, the pumps she had designed were running day and night, and the black water was falling foot by foot, and when the first cart of raw silver ore came rattling up out of the reopened shaft, the entire district had come out to see it. Because a dead mine brought back to life was the closest thing the hard folk of Ironroot had to a miracle. Elira had stood at the pit head in a leather apron, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, no longer the pale ghost who had crept in at the beginning of spring, and she had watched the ore glitter in the sun, and felt nothing so vulgar as triumph, only a deep and grounding satisfaction, the particular piece of a thing built with her own hands and her own mind that no one could take from her by decree. She was 6 months round with child by then, and she had worked to the last week, and would work again a week after, and the miners had learned not to fuss over her, because the one time a foreman had suggested a woman in her condition ought to be resting, she had corrected an error in his shoring calculations that would have killed 4 men, and no one had suggested anything to her since. The city of Hollowmere belonged, in every meaningful sense, to Corvin Nightbane, and it had not taken long for word of the widow who raised the dead mine to reach the black tower at the city's crown. He came to see it himself on a grey morning in the first week of autumn, unannounced, without the retinue an alpha of his standing might have brought. Only 2 guards who kept their distance, and he stood at the edge of the pit and watched the machinery she had built turn beneath the mountain. When she came up out of the shaft, wiping her hands on a rag, and saw him standing there, dark and still and watchful, exactly as she remembered him, she did not startle, and she did not curtsy. She simply looked at him, and he looked at her, and after a moment, a slow recognition moved across his weathered face like sun crossing a valley. He said her name, her true name, the one she had left behind on a pillow with an emerald ring, and she did not deny it. He said that he had wondered, when the reports came of a border widow with an impossible mind, whether it might be her. She said that she had wondered whether he would come himself or send a clerk. He almost smiled. It was the first honest exchange she had shared with anyone of power in longer than she could remember. They walked the length of the pit head together, and she told him plainly what she had built and how, and what it would yield, and what she intended to do with her share, and he listened the way she had once dreamed of being listened to, without interrupting, without condescending, weighing every word as though it might be worth something. When she finished, he was quiet for a time, and then he said that Caelan Stormhold was a fool, and she said that she had reached the same conclusion by a different road. He asked carefully whether she had left the Ashfall court of her own choosing or been cast out, and she told him the truth without flinching, the moon tree, the sister, the papers already drawn to set her aside, the allowance and the border cottage meant to bury her alive in quiet. She did not weep telling it. She had paid that debt already, alone in the dark. Corvin listened, and when she had finished, his jaw was tight and his dark eyes had gone hard, and he said that in his territory a wolf who did the work wore the honor, and that if she wished to build something larger than one mine, he would give her the ground to build it on and stand out of her way. She did not accept at once, because she had learned that the fastest way to lose your freedom was to be grateful for it. Instead, she asked him what he wanted in return, and he told her, bluntly, that Caelan's kingdom was rotting and would fall within 2 years, that when it fell, the 4 territories would either descend into slaughter or be bound together under a leader clever enough to hold them, and that he had spent a decade preparing to be that leader, and had everything he needed except the one thing he had never possessed, an administrator who understood the treaties and the bloodlines and the ledgers well enough to make a peace that would last. He said he had watched her save 100 lives with a single clause at a border parley 2 winters past, while her husband snarled and accomplished nothing, and that he had never forgotten it, and that he was not offering her charity, but a partnership between the only 2 people in the 4 territories who understood that power was administration, and administration was power. Then he waited, and did not push, and that restraint told her more about him than any promise could have. She took a week to decide, and she spent it not agonizing but investigating, because trust, she had learned, was a thing to be verified rather than felt. She walked Hollowmere's streets and asked the miners and the smiths and the market women what kind of Alpha Corvin Nightbane was, and the answers were consistent in a way that could not have been rehearsed. He was hard, they said, and exacting and slow to warm, but he paid what he promised, and he had never once raised a tax without opening the accounts for anyone to read. And when the winter fever had swept the lower tiers 3 years past, he had emptied his own storehouses to feed the sick and gone hungry himself, rather than let a child starve on his mountain. She heard no whispers of cruelty, no tales of favourites raised above merit, no rot beneath the black stone. She compared it, silently, to the court she had fled, and at the end of the week she climbed the winding road to the Black Tower and told Corvin Nightbane that she would build his peace with him as an equal partner in writing, with her name on the charter beside his, and he read the terms she had drafted and signed them without changing a word. Her son was born as the first snow fell on Hollowmere, in a warm, high room in the Black Tower, with Maren's cousin at her side, and Corvin waiting, to everyone's quiet astonishment, in the corridor outside like an anxious kinsman. She named the boy Aldrich, for no one in particular, choosing the name herself, the way she now chose everything. And when they laid him red and squalling in her arms, she felt the last of the phantom ache in her chest close over at last, not because the wound had never been real, but because she had finally built something the wound could not touch. Corvin came in when it was done, and looked at the child with a gravity that surprised her, and he did not say anything foolish or false, only that the boy had strong lungs and a stubborn look, and that he would grow up in a place where his mother's name was spoken with respect. It was, she thought, the truest kindness anyone had offered her since Maren pressed a flask into her hands in a cold kitchen doorway, and she held it close and asked nothing more of it than it was. Meanwhile, 3 days' ride to the west, the court of Calen Stormhold was beginning, slowly and then quickly, to come apart. For the first weeks after Elira's disappearance, the king had scarcely noticed her absence beyond a flash of insulted pride that she had gone without permission and without a scene. He had told the council she was ungrateful. He had wed Marisola beneath the very moon tree where he had first betrayed her sister. A lavish ceremony paid for with grain money. And for a season the court had glittered as it hadn't glittered in years, and Calen had believed, in his shallow certainty, that he had upgraded his life the way one trades a serviceable horse for a showy one. It was only when the first quarter's accounts came due that the ground began to shift beneath him, because no one in the entire palace could make the treasury ledger balance, and the harder his stewards tried, the worse the figures became, and it slowly dawned on the king that the woman he had discarded had not merely kept the books, she had been the books, and she had walked out the door and taken his kingdom's memory with her. Marisol, it turned out, could not read a treaty. She had never needed to. She had spent her life being beautiful and being envied and being told that these were the only currencies that mattered, and now she sat in the consort's chair that her sister had filled and discovered that the chair was not decorative, that it came with a mountain of obligations she had no capacity to meet, that ambassadors expected substance, and councillors expected direction, and the border lords expected the grain and the coin and the careful attention that Elira had lavished on them for 3 years. When Marisol could provide none of it, the whispers began. The Silverbrook alliance that Kaelin had thrown Elira away to secure required a marriage of substance, and not merely of blood, required treaties drafted and terms met, and a consort who could hold her own across a negotiating table. And Marisol could do none of these things, and within 4 months the Silverbrook Alphas had grown cold, and then absent, and then openly contemptuous, and the alliance that was to have crowned Kaelin's reign began, quietly, to curdle. The king raged, in the way of men who have never learned that rage is not a strategy. He sacked stewards and appointed new ones who fared no better. He tore through the archives looking for Elira's records, and found only her cipher, page after page of figures written in a code no living person could break. And he understood at last, with a slow, sick fury, that she had not merely left, she had prepared, that the woman he had dismissed as thin-blooded and weak had spent years quietly making herself indispensable, and then removed herself in a single night, and that he had helped her do it by never once bothering to learn what she actually did. He sent riders east to find her, to the border cottage where he had planned to bury her, and the riders came back empty-handed because the cottage stood empty and had never been occupied, and no one on the eastern road remembered a high-born lady, only a plain travelling widow who had passed through and vanished into the mountains months before. He did not connect the widow to the woman who was, at that very moment, 3 days east, drafting the framework that would one day unmake his throne. Maren watched it all from the healer's cottage at the edge of the palace grounds, and she said nothing, and she smiled to herself in the privacy of her own kitchen, because she had known. She watched Marisol grow thin and frantic beneath the weight of a role she could not fill. She watched Kaelin's temper fray and his allies drift, and the border villages, unfed and untended, begin to send their young men north over the mountains to a city where a mine had come back from the dead, and a widow was said to pay fair wages and ask no questions about a man's past. Maren knew where those young men were going. She knew who they would find when they got there. And when a court messenger came to her one grey afternoon to ask, on the king's behalf, whether the old healer had any notion where the former consort might have fled, Maren looked him in the eye and said that the dead do not leave forwarding addresses, and let him make of that what he would. Then she went back inside and wrote a short letter in a code of her own, and gave it to a young man bound north over the mountains, and the letter reached Hollowmere within the week. By the following spring, the woman who had crept out of a palace kitchen with a bag of hoarded silver had become the second most powerful figure in the Iron Root territories, and no one who worked with her thought it strange, because they had watched her earn it. Elira Ashcroft, as Hollowmere knew her, had taken the single reopened mine and built from it an enterprise that reached into every valley of the north, draining flooded shafts, retimbering collapsed ones, designing pumps and lifts and ventilation that made the deep silver seams profitable for the first time in a generation. But the mines were only the beginning, the proof of concept, the demonstration that she could take a dead thing and make it live. What she was truly building At Corvin Nightbane's side, and increasingly by his open request, was a system of governance, a web of fair contracts and transparent accounts and negotiated alliances that bound the fractious Iron Root Pax into something no border warlord had ever managed to forge, a stable, prosperous, unified territory that ran on ledgers instead of fear. She worked from a set of rooms high in the Black Tower, with her son growing sturdy and dark-eyed in a nursery down the hall, and Maren's cousin, now her steward and dearest friend, managing the household. And every week the territory's business flowed across her desk, and every week she made it better. Corvin gave her authority, not as a gift, but as an acknowledgement of fact, because things she touched succeeded, and things she did not touch stalled, and he was too clever a man and too honest a leader to pretend otherwise. They had grown, over the long turning of the seasons, into something the court she had fled would never have understood, a partnership of true equals, in which he brought the loyalty of the Pax and the strength of his person, and the long, strategic patience of a man who had waited a decade for his moment, and she brought the mind that could turn all of it into a lasting peace. It had become, somewhere in the second year, something more than a partnership, though neither of them had rushed to name it, both being people who had learned to distrust anything that arrived too easily. The intelligence from the west arrived steadily now, carried by the young men who came north over the mountains looking for work, and by Maren's coded letters, and by the merchants who travelled between the territories and reported to Elira's people as a matter of profitable routine. She knew that the Silverbrook alliance had collapsed entirely, that the Ashfall treasury was empty, that Kaelin had raised the border taxes twice in a year and driven half his own population into flight. She knew that Marisol, the strong-blooded bride who was to have secured the kingdom, had produced no heir and no alliance and no competence, and that the king's affection for her had soured into open contempt as the enormity of his miscalculation became impossible to deny. She knew all of it, and she felt no triumph, only a cold and distant clarity, the way one might watch a building one had warned about for years finally begin to collapse. She did not send raiders. She did not gloat. She simply kept building, because she understood something Kaelin never had, that the surest revenge is not to strike your enemy down, but to become so obviously superior that his fall requires no push at all. But there was a shadow at the edge of her clarity, and its name was Lord Vesper Thorn. He had been Kaelin's chief counselor for as long as Elira had known the court, a smooth, pale man with a voice like oiled silk, and she had never trusted him, though she had never been able to prove why. Now, from the vantage of distance and better information, she began to see the shape of him at last. It was Vesper who had first whispered to Kaelin that the Silverbrook alliance required a stronger bride. It was Vesper who had drafted the papers to set Elira aside before the king had even resolved to do it. It was Vesper, she came slowly to understand, who had engineered her entire downfall, not out of any grudge against her, but as a single move in a far larger game. Because a Kaelin who had thrown away his cleverest adviser was a Kaelin who could be steered, weakened, and eventually replaced. She had thought herself the victim of a husband's shallow lust. She was beginning to understand that she had been the victim of a counselor's long strategy, and that the same counselor was even now maneuvering to seize the Ashfall throne for himself once the last of Kaelin's strength had bled away. She brought her suspicions to Corvin, laid out across his great black table on a winter night, with the wind howling off the peaks, and he studied the pattern she had drawn and grew very still, because he too had crossed paths with Vesper Thorn years ago, and had walked away from those meetings feeling as though he had been measured for a coffin. Together they saw the fuller shape of it. Vesper did not want merely the Ashfall throne. Vesper wanted the collapse of the old order entirely, the fall of both kings, Kaelin through incompetence and Corvin through war, so that he might rise from the wreckage as the one man with the patience and the coldness to rule the ruins. He had spent years positioning pieces, cultivating grudges between the territories, funding the very border raids that Corvin was blamed for, all to bring about a bloodletting from which he alone would profit. And Elira, sitting across the table from the man she had come to trust with everything, felt the old cold clarity sharpen into something like anticipation, because she had spent her whole life being underestimated by clever men, and she had learned that there was no more useful weapon in the world. The reversal, when it came, did not announce itself with trumpets. It arrived on a raw morning at the end of the second winter in the form of a travel-stained rider bearing the tarnished seal of the Ashfall crown, requesting an audience with the Alpha of Ironroot on behalf of King Kaelin Stormhold, who wished to propose an alliance. Elira read the message first, as she read all of Corvin's correspondence, and she felt her heart perform a single slow revolution in her chest. Not the torn ache of the old bond, but something steadier and colder, the recognition that the long game had finally reached its final board. Kaelin was coming north. Kaelin, whose kingdom was hollow, whose alliance had failed, whose treasury was dust, was coming to beg his oldest rival for help, and he had no idea, none at all, who truly sat at that rival's right hand. She set the message down and looked out at the high window at the snow falling over Hollowmere, and she permitted herself, for the first time in 2 years, the smallest of smiles. She and Corvin planned it together, with the meticulousness she brought to everything. There would be no ambush, no crude humiliation, because that was not who either of them had become. Kaelin would be received with all the formal courtesy his diminished rank still commanded. He would be brought to the great hall of the Black Tower and seated at the long table and offered the wine and bread of hospitality, and the Alpha of Ironroot's chief minister, the architect of the Northern Peace, would be present at the negotiation as an equal party, as she always was, and Kaelin would simply have to reckon with the fact of her when he laid eyes on her. Corvin had offered, quietly, to warn her guest in advance, to spare her the confrontation if she wished it, and she had thanked him and declined, because she had waited 2 years for this, and she intended to be present for the moment when the man who called her the lesser sister understood exactly what he had discarded. Not to gloat, to witness. There is a difference, and she had earned it. The king arrived on a grey afternoon with a retinue far smaller and shabbier than his pride would once have permitted, his horses thin, his guards' armour dull, and Marisol at his side, wrapped in furs that could not quite hide how the confidence had drained out of her over 2 hard years. Elira watched their arrival from a high window, unseen, and she studied her sister's face with a detachment that surprised her. Marisol had been beautiful once, in a way that turned every head. She was beautiful still, but it was a brittle beauty now, sharpened by anxiety and dimmed by disappointment. The beauty of a woman who had staked everything on being desired and discovered too late that desire was the least durable of currencies. Elira felt no hatred looking at her, and this too surprised her. She felt something closer to pity, and beneath the pity, a flint-hard resolve, because pity was not the same as mercy, and she had not yet decided how much mercy this day would hold. They were shown into the great hall as the early winter dark came down, and torches burned in their iron brackets along the black stone walls, and Corvin Nightbane sat at the head of the long table in a plain, dark coat, wearing no crown, because he had never needed one, his very stillness announcing his authority more clearly than any gold. Cailan entered with his old swagger dented, but not gone, and he made his bow shallower than courtesy required, because even now, even ruined, he could not quite believe he was the lesser man in the room. He began to speak of alliance, of shared interests, of the ancient ties between their peoples, the practiced empty phrases of a man who has always been able to talk his way out of consequences. Corvin let him talk, and then, at the moment they had agreed upon, the Alpha of Ironroot turned his head slightly and said that no agreement would be discussed without his chief minister present, and that she would join them now. Elira stepped out of the shadowed archway at the side of the hall and walked into the torchlight, and she watched the recognition hit Cailan Stormhold like a physical blow. He came half out of his chair, the colour drained from his face, exactly as she remembered her own blood draining beneath the moon tree, and for a moment his mouth worked without sound, and beside him Marisol made a small, strangled noise and went white to the lips. Elira did not hurry. She crossed the hall with the unhurried composure that had become her signature, and she took her seat at Corvin's right hand, and she folded her hands on the table and looked at the man she had once promised her life to. And she said, in a voice as level as still water, that the Alpha was correct, that no agreement would be reached without her, because she was the one who drafted the agreements in this territory, and had been for 2 years. Then she waited, calm and cold, for him to find his voice. Cailan found it at last, and it came out cracked and disbelieving, demanding to know what she was doing there, how she had come to be in the Black Tower, what trickery had placed his own discarded consort at his rival's right hand. And Elira allowed herself the first true pleasure of the day, which was to watch him fail to understand even now, to watch him reach for the old story in which she was a thing that things had been done to, rather than a person who did things. She told him, plainly, that there was no trickery, that she had walked out of his palace on her own 2 feet on the night he called her the lesser sister beneath the moon tree, that she had come north with a satchel of maps and a bag of silver she had saved coin by coin from the accounts he never bothered to check, that she had raised a dead mine from the black water and built a fortune, and then built a government, and that she now stood between him and the alliance he had ridden 3 days to beg for. She said all of it without heat, and the absence of heat was more devastating than any fury could have been. Marisol broke first, as Elira had known she would, because Marisol had never learned the discipline of silence. She rose from her chair and cried out that this was impossible, that Elira had been sent away, that Elira was weak and thin-blooded, and no one, and the words died in her throat as she looked around the great hall, at the strength of the black stone, and the loyalty in the faces of Corvin's people, and the quiet, unassailable authority of the sister she had helped to cast out. Elira looked at her for a long moment, and then said, gently, almost kindly, that she remembered those words, that she had heard them clearly from the shadow of a hedge on the night Marisol spoke them, and that she wished her sister well of them now. Then she turned her attention back to Cailan, because Marisol had never been the true architect of anything, and did not merit the weight of a reckoning. The reckoning belonged to the king, and behind the king to a pale counsellor who was not in the room, and Elira had prepared for both. Cailan tried, then, to command her, because commanding was the only language he had ever truly spoken. He drew himself up and summoned the old resonance of his voice, the alpha timbre that had once made courts fall silent, and he told her that she was still, by the laws of the 4 territories, bound to answer to the crown she had served, that her cleverness did not erase her duty, that she would help him or answer for her ingratitude. And Elira listened to the command wash over her, and she felt it find no purchase at all, no old reflex of fear, no residual loyalty, nothing but the clean, flat surface of a woman who had rebuilt herself entirely out of his reach. She said simply that his voice didn't work on her anymore, that it had stopped working the night she watched him choose an illusion over the woman who kept his kingdom alive, and that if he wished to leave the Black Tower with anything at all, he would sit down, lower his voice, and speak to her as a supplicant, because that was what he was. He sat down. It was the single most telling moment of the entire audience, the great Alpha King of the Ashfall territories lowering himself into a chair at his rival's table, because his discarded consort told him to, and everyone in the hall saw it and understood what it meant. Then Elira laid out the truth of his situation with the pitiless precision of the ledgers she had once kept for him. She told him the exact figure of his empty treasury, because she still remembered the accounts and had tracked their decline. She told him the names of the border villages he had lost to the north, and the number of his people who now paid taxes to Corvin Nightbane instead. She told him that his kingdom would not survive another winter on its present course, and that he knew it, which was why he had come. And then she told him the thing he didn't know, the thing that made him go very still and pale, that the man who had engineered every step of his ruin, who had whispered him toward casting her out, and drafted the papers, and poisoned the Silverbrook Alliance, and funded the raids that isolated him, was his own chief counselor, Lord Vesper Thorn, who was at that very moment preparing to seize the Ashfall throne the instant Kaelin was weak enough to fall. She watched the Knowledge Land, watched Kaelin's mind race back over 2 years of quiet manipulation, and begin, too late, to see the pattern she had seen from 3 days' distance. He said Vesper's name like a curse, and then like a question, and she saw the exact moment he believed her, because it explained everything that his pride had refused to explain, every failed alliance and mysterious shortfall and convenient disaster. And in that moment, Kaelin Stormhold understood the true scope of his blindness, that he had not merely thrown away a wife, he had thrown away the one person clever enough to have protected him from the serpent at his own right hand, and that his ruin was not bad luck or her absence alone, but the deliberate work of a man he had trusted above all others. He looked at Elira across the table with something that was no longer contempt and no longer command, something that looked, at last, like the beginning of understanding, and he asked her, in a voice stripped of all its old resonance, what she wanted. What she wanted was not what he expected, because he still thought in terms of grudges, and she had long since moved past them into the colder country of strategy. She did not want his throne pulled down in a war that would kill thousands of the border folk she had spent years trying to feed. She did not want Marisol disgraced, because Marisol disgraced herself sufficiently merely by existing in that hall. She wanted Vesper Thorn. She laid it out with Corvin at her side, the two of them speaking as the single unit they had become, that Ironroot would enter into no alliance with a kingdom about to fall to a usurper, but that Ironroot would help Kaelin expose and destroy Vesper Thorn on precise terms, in exchange for concessions that would bind the 2 territories into a lasting and equitable peace, with the border villages protected, the taxes reformed, the treaties she herself would draft, honored on both sides. It was not mercy, exactly, and it was not vengeance. It was governance, the thing she had always been best at, turned now upon the ruin of the man who had never valued it. The trap they laid for Vesper Thorn was a thing of paper and patience, built the way Elira built everything, without a single drop of blood spilled where a signature would do. She knew, from her years inside the court, exactly how Vesper moved, how he kept his own secret ledgers, how he laundered the funds that paid the border raiders through a series of shell merchants whose names she still remembered. She knew the neglected paperwork that Kaelan had never bothered to read, the authorizations Vesper had forged the king's seal upon, the debts the counselor had incurred in Kaelan's name to fund his private ambition. All of it was recoverable, all of it was documented, if one knew where to look. And Elira had always known where to look, because looking had been her entire life at that court, while the powerful men around her looked only at each other. She drafted a plan by which Kaelan would return to his palace and behave exactly as a broken king should behave, defeated and pliable, and would lull Vesper into believing the throne was ripe to fall, while Elira's agents, moving through the merchant networks she had spent 2 years cultivating, gathered the proof that would hang him. It took a season, through the thaw and into the green of a new spring, and Elira orchestrated it from the Black Tower, like a composer conducting an orchestra she alone could hear. Maren, still at her post in the healer's cottage, became her eyes inside the palace, reporting Vesper's movements in coded letters carried north. The merchants Vesper thought he controlled turned out, one by one, to be more loyal to the fair contracts of Ironroot than to the threats of a counselor, and they opened their books to Elira's people. Kaelan, to his limited credit, played his broken part convincingly, perhaps because it required so little acting, and slowly the noose of documentation drew tight around Vesper Thorn, without the man ever suspecting that the discarded consort he had disposed of 2 years before was the hand that pulled it. And through all of it, Elira felt the strange and final healing of the old wound in her chest, because she understood now that the betrayal beneath the moon tree had not been the ruin of her life, but the making of it, that Vesper had meant to destroy her, and had instead set her free, and that she was about to repay the favor in a coin he would very much dislike. The end of Vesper Thorn came in the great hall of the Ashfall Palace on a bright morning in late spring, in front of the full assembled council, and Elira Ashcroft was there to see it, seated among the delegation from Ironroot in a gown of dark northern silk, no longer hiding in the shadow of any hedge. Kaelan, following the script she had written for him to the letter, convened the council on a pretext, and then, at the appointed moment, produced the evidence, the forged authorizations, and the secret ledgers and the merchant testimonies, and the proof of the funded raids, all of it laid out with a precision that was unmistakably not the king's own work. Vesper Thorn, who had spent a decade being the cleverest man in every room, understood in an instant that he had been outmaneuvered, and his pale, composed face cracked at last, and he looked wildly around the hall for the mind that had undone him. His gaze passed over Kaelan, whom he had never respected, and landed on the woman in dark silk, seated calmly among the northern delegation, and Elira watched the recognition dawn in his eyes exactly as she had watched it dawn in Kaelan's 2 seasons before, and she inclined her head to him, once, with grave courtesy, the way one acknowledges a worthy opponent who has lost. He tried to speak, to spin, to talk his way free, as such men always do, but the evidence was too complete and the council too shaken, and the guards took him before he could finish his first sentence. He would not be executed, because Elira had counseled against martyrs, and a dead Vesper was a story that could be retold in his favor, while a living Vesper, stripped of everything, imprisoned in a border fortress to grow old, contemplating how thoroughly a woman he had discarded as a pawn had dismantled his life's work, was a far more perfect justice. As they led him from the hall, He passed close to where she sat, and he paused, and he looked at her with a strange, terrible respect, and he said quietly that he had underestimated her, and she looked back at him and said, just as quietly, that everyone did, once, and that she had built her entire life on the space that mistake created. Then they took him away, and the great hall of the Ashfall Palace was silent, and the reign of the serpent who had ruled it from the shadows was over. What remained was the resolution, and Elira approached it with the same clear eyes she had brought to everything since the night beneath the moon tree. The alliance between Ironroot and Ashfall was signed within the month, on the equitable terms she had drafted, and it held because agreements she built tended to hold. Kaelan kept his throne, diminished and chastened, ruling now under the watchful partnership of the North, his kingdom slowly healing under the tax reforms and grain provisions that Elira insisted upon for the sake of the border folk who had suffered most. He was not destroyed, and this was itself a kind of mercy, though a cold and unsentimental one, the mercy of a woman who understood that a ruined kingdom serves no one, and that the people of Ashfall deserved better than the vengeance she could easily have taken. She gave them peace instead. It was, in the end, a far more complete victory than any conquest, because it left Kaelan alive to understand, every single day for the rest of his reign, precisely what he had thrown away beneath that tree. Marisol did not fare as gently, though her fate too was of her own authorship. The marriage that had produced no heir and no alliance, and no competence, dissolved under its own hollowness. And Kaelan, stripped of his illusions, set her aside as casually as he had once set aside her sister, and the court that had envied her beauty turned its back on her without a second thought, because beauty untethered from any other worth is the most quickly forgotten thing in the world. She came north once, in the second year of the peace, to plead with Elira for a place, for shelter, for the protection of the sister she had helped to betray, and Elira received her with a courtesy that was neither warm nor cruel. She listened to Marisol's tears and her belated apologies, and her account of how Vesper had used her too, whispered her toward the moon tree, flattered her ambition, made her a weapon against her own blood. Elira believed her, more or less, and it changed nothing, because understanding why a wound was inflicted does not unmake the wound. She gave Marisol a modest allowance and a quiet house in a northern valley, the very fate that had once been designed for Elira herself, and she noted the symmetry without triumph, and she sent her sister away to live out her days in the comfortable obscurity she had tried to impose on another. And Elira herself claimed the prize that was hers, not by seizing it, but by building it, brick by patient brick, over the long years of the peace. She and Corvin Nightbane were wed in the Black Tower of Hollowmere in the third spring, without a moon tree, without the sacred trappings that had crowned her first betrayal, in a plain ceremony that celebrated a partnership already proven, rather than promising one untested. She married him not because she needed a king, having become in every practical sense the co-ruler of the North, but because she had come, slowly and warily, and with all the caution of a woman who had been burned to the ground once already, to trust him, and trust freely given after such a loss was the rarest and most valuable thing she owned. Her son Aldric grew up in that black stone city, calling Corvin father, and being raised by both of them to understand that worth was a thing you built with your own hands and your own mind, and never a thing granted to you by the favor of the powerful. And the four territories, bound together at last under a peace that Elira had drafted and Corvin had secured, entered a generation of prosperity, such as none of them had known. Sometimes, in the quiet years that followed, Elira would stand at the high window of the Black Tower and look south toward the mountains that separated her new life from her old one, and she would think of the woman who had crept out of a palace kitchen with a torn bond in her chest and a bag of hoarded silver in her hand, and she would feel neither bitterness nor pride, only a deep and settled peace. She had not been broken by the betrayal beneath the moon tree. She had been forged by it. The words Kaelin spoke that night, that she was the lesser sister, that a king would never choose her, had been meant to end her, and instead they had become the first stones of everything she built, because she had taken his contempt and made of it a foundation, and upon that foundation she had raised a life so much larger than the gilded cage he offered that he could not have imagined it in his shallowest dreams. He had built the gallows meaning to hang her from it. She had bought the lumber and built a throne. And so, if this story of a woman discarded and a woman risen has stirred something in you, if you felt the cold clarity settle in her chest beneath that moonlit tree and the slow, fierce satisfaction of watching her build a life no one could take from her, then let that feeling stay with you a moment longer, because it belongs to you as much as to her. The truth beneath this tale is not that revenge is sweet, for Elira never once reached for revenge. The truth is that your worth was never theirs to grant or to withhold. It was always yours. The people who dismiss you, who trade you for something shinier, who call you the lesser and mean it as a sentence, are only ever measuring you by the smallness of their own vision. What they discard as worthless is very often the single most valuable thing they will ever hold, and they learn its value only in the empty space where it used to be. That is the oldest and hardest lesson in the world, and Elira learned it beneath a tree that was supposed to be sacred, and she carried it north over the mountains and turned it into a kingdom. Loyalty cannot be bought, and it cannot be commanded, and it certainly cannot be replaced with something merely beautiful. True strength is not inherited from a bloodline or bestowed by a crown. It is built quietly in the dark, one saved coin and one mastered skill and one honored promise at a time, until the day it stands so tall that no one can pretend not to see it. And the boundaries we draw, the moment we decide that we will no longer be small so that someone else can feel large, those boundaries do not merely protect us, they save us. They are the threshold across which a whole new life becomes possible, if only we have the courage to walk through the door and never look back at a house that was never a home. So if Elira's journey moved you, if you saw even a flicker of your own story in hers, do something for me before you go. Give this video a like, because it genuinely helps more people find their way to stories like this one. Share it with someone who needs the reminder tonight, someone who has been made to feel like the lesser sister, the overlooked one, the discarded one, someone who needs to hear that the space where they were cast out can become the ground on which they build everything. And if you want more stories of quiet strength and earned triumph, and the cold, clean justice of being underestimated by people who will live to regret it, subscribe and join this community, because we celebrate exactly this kind of story here, and there is always another one coming. Then tell me, down in the comments, the moment Elira became truly free. Was it when she left the ring upon the pillow, when the black water fell and the silver rose, or when she looked across that long table and told a king his voice no longer worked on her? I read every answer, and I want to know which moment lived in you. Until the next story, remember this: no one can discard what they were never strong enough to hold. Your worth is yours. Go and build,